This morning I have three scriptures that we're going to look at. Today is the Old Testament-focused scriptures. Scriptures will be on the overheads in front of you, but you're also welcome to read along in your pew Bibles. The first one is from 2 Kings. In your pew Bibles, that's on page 281. We're going to look at 2 Kings chapter 25. We're going to read verses 1 through 6 and then skip down to verses 8 through 12. This is a particular story from the life of the ancient Israelites. So as you're listening to this, listen for the story of what was happening in the lives of the Israelites at this time. 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 through 6 and 8 through 12. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, and on the 10th day of the 10th month, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon marched against Jerusalem with his whole army, and he encamped around and outside of the city and built siege works all around it. And the city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. Now by the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. And then the city wall was broken through. And the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah. But the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. And all his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. Skipping down to verse 8. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls surrounding Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. Our second and third scriptures will both come from the book of the prophet Jeremiah. In your pew Bibles, it's on page 558. It'll also be on the overheads in front of you. We're going to read Jeremiah starting in chapter 29 and verses 4 through 14, and then we'll skip to chapter 31. This is Jeremiah chapter 29, starting in verse 4. Now this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all of those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Instead, this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek me, and you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places to where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Third and final scripture reading, skipping a couple of chapters over to Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness, and will remember their sins no more. This morning, I'm doing a sermon that's in a series that I've been preaching on. The last couple of Sundays, I've preached to you sermons about how you might look at difficulty in your own lives, in your personal life, in the life of an individual human, and how you might see God's work, God's hand, in the midst of that. How God can take even the most difficult things in our lives, even the wrongdoings of ourselves, the sin of our own actions, or the sin of the people around us, or the brokenness in this world, or the evil that is done through the spirits or powers that be around us, take even those things, the most difficult things, even death itself, and work things towards good in our individual lives. Well, today I'm taking that concept that I've been preaching to you about from an individual way and starting to turn it to more of a group way, a group dynamic, a concept that has more to do with us as a people, as Christians, and as larger groups, rather than just as individuals. In particular, I'll tell you now, the purpose of where I'm going with this sermon series is to get you to a point over the next few Sundays where we're going to be talking about why church, why we do this thing we call church, what is the purpose of a worshiping community, of a people of God in our modern time. I'm going to preach a whole series on that coming up. But to get to that point, I'm giving you these ideas of where God is still present in the midst of our lives. And there's difficult moments from the individual lives we lead to the group lives we lead. And so today is that sermon, a sermon about God's presence in the midst of the difficulty of being a people in our modern time. And so to give you that sermon, I thought I would give it to you in context. And so the context that you're getting today is from this Old Testament, from the ancient Israelites. I've entitled this sermon, Something New. And yes, you're supposed to be thinking of that popular phrase from marriages that we like to do, something borrow. So what is it? Okay, you all know it. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And yeah, you're supposed to think of that because I just read to you this last one about God saying he was a husband to the ancient Israelites. The ancient Israelites broke the covenant that he made with them, right? Remember, this is the story of the people of God. This is a story of humans. This is a story of our own lives as individuals even. When we make these promises, just like I was talking about with the children, whether it be a more sort of loose promise with your pinky, although I'll tell you this, if you start making promises with little children and you make it physical and you use your pinky, you better make good on that promise for that little child. Because once you've bound it with the touching of flesh like that, it means something to them. So don't take that too lighthearted just because you're using your pinky. Or whether it's a promise that uses a ring in the form of something that you do, hopefully with just that one person, that you take seriously, that you commit to in the form of a marriage relationship. Or whether it's contracts that we sign through work. We do all kinds of promises in our lives. And yet we know as human beings and imperfect creatures that we all are, we often fall short. And the story of the people of God and the relationship with God is the consistency of humanity, of the people of God even, those whom God has chosen out from all of humans to be his people, regularly falling short. And that's the story that we arrive in today. I'm going to tell you that story, just a quick recap of what I read to you, of a specific period of time that was perhaps the most heightened example of that breaking of that covenant, of that promise, to get you to our own time, to elucidate and expound upon the age that we're living in and where I think we might be going. So the story goes from the 2 Kings text that I read to you, is this famous story from the ancient Israelites when, after many years, right? Remember that the ancient story of what God is doing in humanity, from the creation of Adam and Eve all the way up to the person of Abraham and then his descendants, that it seems to be this arc, this story arc that keeps going forward, keeps going up. There's more people turning to God, that God is doing new things, giving them new places, and more people, and more descendants, and more, and lands, and the promised land. And then all of a sudden, after all of this building up, from the very creation of humanity on this earth, to the first covenants with Abraham, and some of the people who came slightly before him, and then his descendants after him, to the promised land that they live in, to the 12 tribes, to the kingdoms of ancient Israel and Judah. You get to these pinnacle moments in the ancient Israelites' existence, and then all of a sudden, the bottom drops out, right? Remember what happens with the story I just read for you? It may have got a little confusing with different kings' names or commanders' names or which king was going where, but basically what happened was the ancient Israelites started turning towards doing the things that their cultures around were doing, worshiping false gods and idols mixed in with sometimes worshiping the one true God, conflating culture and the world around, losing practice of what it meant to follow God, bowing down because they had to be vassal, to be servants of other more powerful countries around, losing sight of having a vision that went beyond just the here and the now, only thinking about how they would survive today and what they might do tomorrow, rather than about what it meant to be a people of God, to serve the one true Lord, that might meant risking of themselves. And so they found themselves in multiple scenarios where they were apostates, where they were worshiping false idols, where they were bowing down and kowtowing to the will of the powers that be around them. And eventually, they chose the wrong side. They sided with Egypt against the Babylonians, and the Babylonians grew in power. They revolted against Babylon, and when Babylon overthrew Egypt, they came into the promised land. They walked up to the walls of Jerusalem. They surrounded the city, and they laid siege to the ancient holy city of Jerusalem with its temple up on the hill for over a year. And they starved the ancient Israelites into submission. And then, when they were at the moment that they were going to basically all die from no food, and they saw what was about to happen, the king that was still alive and still ruling in Jerusalem from the ancient Israelites gathered his men together and said, "Let's book it." And he fled out the back door. And the Babylonians charged through, tearing down a spot in the wall. And when they saw the king running, they chased after him, they caught him, they captured him, they killed most of his army. They killed the strong men among the ancient Israelites. They enslaved the ruling class and the priests. They killed some as an example, and they enslaved others. They took most of the people back to Babylon to be their slaves back in their homeland, and then left the poorest in the land to be farming the fields and sending back food and money to Babylon. And before they left, the scriptures say they tore down all the walls around the ancient city of Jerusalem, so it had no defenses. And they burned the big houses of the rich people and the ruling classes. And they burned the palace of the king. And then lastly, it says the commander of the Babylonian army walked up to the temple, the great temple. They stripped it of all of its glory. They took all of the brass and the gold and the silver. They ripped it off of all of the holy items and the pillars and the columns. They walked into the Holy of Holies, and they took the Ark of the Covenant with its angelic beings that had been carved out of brass and gold on top. They melted things down so that they could, or tore it or smashed it down to make it easier to carry back to Babylon. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol, remember what that phrase means, Ark of the covenant, right? The ark was literally a thing. You've seen the images depicted in movies like Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark. The lost ark was lost at that moment. The ark, never to be seen again in human history, was lost with the Babylonians coming in. And it was more than just a symbol, more than just a box with some ornately carved things on top, more than just the tablets that Moses had received from God on Mount Sinai about how you were supposed to live, the things that God said to do and to not do. More than the manna that was stored in it from when they wandered in the desert and God provided for them. More than the symbols that were all around it was the thing that it stood for, the promise, the covenant itself. It was a box, but it represented the promise, the covenant of God, just like this cross represents the promise, the covenant that we have today. And when the Babylonians came in and they took that and they stripped the temple bare and then they smashed the stones down and burned it to make good and sure they couldn't put the stones back one upon another, the ancient people, the Israelites, the people of God, thought, God has abandoned us. God has broken his promise with us. God is weak, or God is dead. And they were carried off into Babylon, those who survived, those who were allowed to live, and made to be slaves. And in Babylon, those who remained had to struggle with what was their new reality. Many turned away from the faith. Many became just like the Babylonians in their style of worship, because when one culture came in and conquered another in that ancient time, it was felt that their God must be more powerful or must be more true. And so our God was impotent or weak or not really true to begin with. And so some turned to the Babylonian gods, but others who felt that their God was sending them a message, who had heard the prophecies from generations leading up to that moment that had said, turn back or else God will allow something to happen to you. Come back, worship the one true God, or else God will allow your breaking of the covenant to have real consequences. Come back to worshiping the one true God, or there will be realities in your life that will be hard to deal with. And there were those who remembered those prophets, remember what people had said, remembered the warnings, and thought, no, this is not God being dead. This is not God breaking his covenant. This is God making good on what he has said all along. And so now the question for us is, in the midst of the reality that was partially our own creating and partially the world around us, how are we going to do something new? Are we still going to worship that God who said this would happen all along? Are we still going to be the people that he called us to be? Or are we going to be something different? And what's amazing is that in the midst of that captivity, in the midst of that slavery, in the midst of the loss of the temple, and remember, it wasn't just the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant that was lost, it was the temple itself. And all of Jewish practice, ancient Jewish practice, centered around the temple. The temple was necessary. Remember that even before the temple was built, the Israelites, while they wandered in the desert, had built a roaming temple, a tent version of the temple. The temple became an important thing, a necessary thing, a place to sacrifice to God, a place to appease God, a house for God, the Spirit of God on this earth. And without that, their religion didn't make much sense. They didn't know how to do the things that were to please God, to serve God. They didn't know where to make the sacrifices. They didn't know how to practice worshiping the one true God without the temple space. And so they had a crisis, more than just about what they thought about God, theologically and personally, but also about how they would practice religiously the worship of this one true God. And it was in the midst of that Babylonian slavery, in the midst of this crisis of country, of culture, of faith, that this new thing started to happen. And that new thing that happened there precipitates all the way down to our modern time. For you see, the current version of Judaism and its rabbinical teaching traditions was spawned, was started, was seeded in, and caught fire in the midst of slavery in Babylon. They started a new idea. They said, our temple, it's gone. Our ark, with all its symbols of the promises of God and that covenant, the covenant that we broke, we don't know where it is. It may be melted down in the coffers of the Babylonian king. All of the things that we used to sacrifice and to worship God are done. We don't know if they exist at all anymore. What shall we do? And they found new ways to teach the Word of God and to start to practice worshiping God and living by God's precepts. And it was in those new actions, without a temple, without the religiosity of their past, without the signs and the symbols and the holy objects that had existed, that they started to find a new way to be the people of God. And that rabbinic, that teaching tradition, is what carried on even when they came back, even when they built the second temple, all the way up to the time of Jesus, even when they revolted against the Romans, because they apparently hadn't learned that revolting against the major power of the time often results in bad things. And even when the second temple then was destroyed by the Romans some 70 years after Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected. That same tradition that happened in Babylon, they remembered when the second temple was destroyed. And that same tradition kept them alive and have kept their worship, their people group, sustained all the way down to today. It's a pretty amazing thing when you think about it. That out of the midst of destruction, utter destruction, out of the midst of their religion and the signs and the symbols of their promises, their covenant, their relationship with God being taken and destroyed, out of the midst of living as slaves, they would come up with this new way to be the people of God. A prophet like Jeremiah came along to give them that vision. They didn't just come up with it on their own. A prophet like Jeremiah spoke out of the midst of that to say the Spirit of God is still with you. So now we arrive at our modern time, and I've given you some of the history of the ancient Israelites to the modern Jewish people. We, brothers and sisters, who are Christians in our modern time, are inheritors of that same tradition. Now, we live in a time that is a difficult one. It is a challenging moment in human history across the globe, and especially, I think, in the Western world. I've spent a significant part of this summer gathering with other ministers. There was a group of 12 of us from the Presbyterian, other Presbyterian ministers, doing study, continuing education for ministers. But our most recent one, which was a couple weeks ago, we spent with an author who, his name is Mark Tidsworth, who writes about this thing. His title of the book we were studying is called Shift. The shift that is happening in our modern time. We live in a transition moment in our culture, in America, and in the Western world, and really, I think, in culture in general. You know, as I was growing up in this community, I remember going from learning the Dewey Decimal card catalog system in the libraries, to using nothing but computers by the time I got to high school. I remember when the phones we had were attached to the wall in our house, to when by the time I was around like junior high, we had like a brick-sized cell phone that my mom kept in the car. So by the time I got out of high school, most of the kids I knew had their own little pocket flip-open cell phones, and now everybody carries a computer in their pocket. I remember when nobody had a computer at home when I was a kid, and you hand-wrote all your reports for school. So when I got to high school, everybody had a computer, and the teachers were starting to require us to type our reports. You know, just those little examples alone from my one little life is a pretty significant shift culturally, technologically wise. But if you look at what's happening around us, and if you think of yourself in sort of this narrative of what is human history, and especially Western history, and especially American history, we are literally living in the time shift between the 20th century and the 21st century. And in the midst of that, when you add on the technological changes that are happening, it is exponentially increasing change around us. And it is being felt by all of us in ways that we often don't really think about, but just try to survive in the midst of. Significantly, no longer do many households able to afford living off of one income. Now you need two people to work, often full-time, or at least one full-time, one part-time, just to make ends meet. That shift alone is more significant than many people have ever really given much thought to. The divide between income stratosphere, even though we live in a recovering economy, is more significant now than it ever has been in American history. In other words, the majority of us are much further down that scale than where the income, the reality of the wealth in this country is not felt by the majority of its people. I could go on and on about the lists of things that are new, that are different, that are changing around us, but the fundamental thing that I want to present to you here in this space is a felt thing that happened to me while I was going through this presbytery as a seminary student and doing the church part of it. I remember a day when I came back to shift from being an inquirer to a candidate, which is part of the roles you go up before you become possibly an ordained person. And I had to sit down and do various types of interviews and reviews and tests and all kinds of stuff that they make you do before you can become a minister in our denomination. I was sitting down with a group of the elders in our presbytery offices, and I remember one senior elder asking me, "Why is it, Tyler, that as a young man you want to become a minister of a denomination that's dying?" Right? Not even like getting smaller, not even like going through change, but just flat out, her words, dying. I remember sitting there thinking about that for a moment. First thinking about that's an unfair question. Then second thinking about, no, this is a legitimate question after I thought about it for a moment. This is a real thing going on around us. There are people feeling like church is dying in our midst. And not just the older mainline denominations. There are some bigger non-denominational churches going on around us, but I got news for you, brothers and sisters. Some of these ministers who even do these bigger churches, they lament because they feel like they're just one bad performance Sunday away from half of it being gone. In other words, they got to perform an A game at 110% every single Sunday to draw the people in, and if they're just short a little bit, then a lot of that attendance is just there for the A game, right? That they're feeling it too, even if it is on a different scale. That it's being felt across our culture that faith, religious practice in general, is becoming spiritualized, or just spirituality, or worse, non-belief altogether. In the midst of that time that we live in, where what was working in the past, they've used words like, in the 20th century, the church was an attractional model. The church built buildings, that it had programs, that it had services that it offered where people came in of their own volition. Part of it was because we lived in a culture that said if you're going to be a good citizen, you have to be affiliated with some church in your community. But part of it was because we lived in a culture that's the way people were oriented, that they came to those things. But in this shift of this thing that's happening around us, in this busier lives that we lead, in the multiple workplace, multiple people, both parents having to work, in the technology that's getting faster, in the busyness of life, and the requirement of children in order to compete to get into college, having to have multiple extracurriculars, in a world where Sunday morning is as programmed with other stuff as it is with any sort of worship stuff, you have to ask yourself, what is happening in the church? I answered that question. I've told you the answer to that question before, but I'm going to tell you again real quick now, and then I'm going to give you what I think we're in the midst of. I told the answer to that question after I thought about it for a moment of two things. One, I said just because something's getting smaller doesn't necessarily mean that it's dying. And I referenced that image of the test of fire when it comes to purifying metal. That you take a mountain of material and you end up with a very small amount of stuff, but it is stronger, more durable as a result. And then I said, if it is going to die, because it might, our denomination as it currently exists has only been around since the 80s because it was a unification denomination of two other versions, actually the North and the South churches of Presbyterian united in the 80s to create the current PCUSA. So it's not been around that long. It comes from other denominations that go back further. But even if this current version, quote, dies in its current form, I believe in a God that brings forth new life from ashes. And I said, so if I'm going to be a leader in the midst of that, then I'll be a leader in the midst of what's happening new, coming out of the ashes. This is the thing that Mark was talking about with this shift happening in churches, but he shifted it in a different way. Language is a little bit different because if you look around you, we're not all dead in this room. So what's happening in the midst of it? He said, the thing that he sees happening is is this transition. He said he looks forward to a day when he can look back with perhaps his grandkids, or maybe even further on with a couple of great-grandkids. And grandkids might be asking him, Granddad, how did you help the church to get through this difficult time of transition? In other words, that he spoke a little bit of hope in the midst of this situation, that it may not just be dying, or it might be changing, but becoming something new. And the challenge for us, who are now living in the midst of this transition moment, culturally and all the things changing in life around us, and in the church and religious and faith practices, is what can we do in terms of our creative minds and thinking about what that new thing might be? Rather than just seeing and only focusing on what was no longer being as applicable or as workable or as attractive, rather than just focusing on that seeming not to work and, quote, dying, looking at this moment where things are changing and seeing about what might be new happening out from it. I like the metaphor that he used of flying an airplane, although sometimes I like to use the metaphor of sailing a ship, or if you want, driving a car. You're on a journey, you're in this thing, this vessel, this ship, this car, this airplane. You're moving along in your life. You're going from one point to another, whether or not you like it, because the world keeps spinning. And as you're going along, new things are happening around you. The conditions are changing. If you're flying the airplane, turbulence starts to occur. Bad weather comes in. New environmental conditions happen. If you're sailing on the ship, the seas get choppy. Rocks start to come out of the ocean here and there. Difficulty lies in your wake. If you're driving the car, the road is bumpy. The pavement ends. The gravel comes to a clearing. You're now on a dirt road. What do you do? As the conditions change around you, the challenge is not just how do you drive different, but you're trying to rebuild and restructure the airplane you're flying, the ship you're sailing on, the car you're driving at the same time. And that's what we're in the midst of. We're flying this vessel. We're sailing this ship. We're driving along, and we're having to look at what's changing around us while we're moving and modify the structure, the thing that we're driving on. That's a challenge. It's a difficulty. It's a reality. But it's also a possibility. And the thing that I really want to say to you today, the whole point of this sermon, is to remind you, as I gave you the history of what the ancient Israelites did and went through, I would argue for you that they went through an even harder time, an even more difficult transition, an even more radical moment in human history, and yet God walked with them in the midst of it. And in the midst of it, an even more difficult moment, God helped them to create something new that has lasted for them ever since, even to this day. And I would argue that though we are going through a challenging moment, a somewhat similarly difficult moment, a moment that may even feel like dying to some, that in the midst of it, in the midst of that transition, in the midst of those difficulties, in the midst of the unknown, God is walking right along beside us, helping us to try those new things, to reform that airplane, that ship, that car that we're driving, and to help us go forward in a new way. If you think of it that way, if you remember that God has been with people through similar moments and through even harder times, and helped them to create something new and even more powerful and even better than what they had before, then maybe you can hold on to just a glimmer of hope that even in the midst of this transition, even in the midst of the difficulty, even in the midst of what may feel like death lurking at the door, God's doing a new thing and can do a new thing with us.